At 5:12 in the morning, the back kitchen of Mercer and Bloom lit up beneath a blue-white fluorescent glow that forgave nothing. Not the dark circles under anyone's eyes, not the dried flour clinging to wrists, not the tiny cracks in the floor tiles that Natalie Mercer had always promised herself she would fix once the shop was doing better. Not even the photograph hanging on the wall beside the rack of baking trays, where she and Ethan Mercer stood together on opening day 10 years earlier, both of their hair messy, black t-shirts dusted with white flour, eyes red from being awake since 3 in the morning, but smiling so wide they looked like two people who genuinely believed that if they loved each other enough, worked hard enough, woke up early enough, every debt would eventually learn to shrink before a good loaf of bread. Steam fogged the small window overlooking the alley behind the shop, where Portland rain fell silently in thin lines over metal trash bins and empty flour sacks. The air carried the smell of sourdough starter, cold butter, coffee roasted the night before still lingering in the grinder, damp towels, the faintest trace of burnt sugar from yesterday's slightly overbaked almond batch, and the metallic chill of a morning before the city had fully woken. Natalie stood at the stainless steel table, both hands dusted with flour all the way into the creases of her nails, a charcoal apron tied around her waist, her hair twisted loosely at the nape of her neck, staring at the sheet of paper lying directly beneath that old photograph. The paper had just been printed, its edges still faintly curled from the heat of the printer, the black letters sharp against the white page, so cold and clean it looked as though it did not belong in this kitchen, did not belong beside loaves waiting to be scored before going into the oven, did not belong in a shop with a hand-painted wooden sign out front that read, "Good bread takes time." The first clause stated, both parties agree to maintain their public marital status for a minimum period of 12 months in the best interest of Mercer and Bloom. Natalie read the sentence 3 times. The first time she read it like someone trying to understand a contract. The second time she read it like a wife watching her own name become part of an asset. The third time she was no longer reading. She was only staring at the words public marital status, and hearing something very small break inside her. Not the sound of glass shattering, not the slam of a door, but something more like the thin crackle of a loaf cooling in the first few seconds after it comes out of the oven. A sound too quiet for anyone except the person standing closest to hear, but once heard, impossible to mistake. It meant the structure inside had changed forever. Ethan stood on the other side of the table, one hand wrapped around a cup of black coffee, the other resting on the edge of the paper, as though he were afraid that if he let go, Natalie would sweep the agreement onto the floor, or tear it in half right there in the middle of prep. He had printed it in the small office in the back, the room that had once been where they kept coats, utility bills, and recipe notes written in pencil. He was still wearing a black crewneck sweater and dark jeans, his hair slightly damp from walking through the rain from the parking lot, his face handsome in the kind of way that local magazines love to put on the cover of their lifestyle section. Ethan Mercer had the kind of face that made people want to believe the stories he told. He had a smile warm enough, eyes attentive enough, and a voice low and slow enough to make a new customer standing in front of the bread case feel as if they were not just buying a sourdough loaf, but stepping into a small community where the married owners remembered their name, remembered whether they liked their waffles less sweet or their latte with oat milk, remembered which college their son had just gone to, and whether their mother had recovered from hip surgery. Ethan had once been the sales miracle of Mercer and Bloom, the man who could stand in front of customers on a rainy November day and talk about wild yeast as if he were talking about faith, who could tell the story of 2 spouses leaving steady jobs to build a small dream from nothing, who could make a local reporter write that Mercer and Bloom was not just a bakery but proof that love could still be kneaded with flour, baked with patience, and shared over hot coffee. Natalie had once loved that about him. She had once stood behind the counter, wiping the bread knife in her hand, watching Ethan talk to customers and feeling her chest swell with pride. Now with that same voice, that same calmness, those same eyes that knew exactly when to soften, he said, "Nat, this isn't something I want to turn cold. But we need clarity. If we don't put it in writing, everything becomes emotional later and emotion ruins decisions." Natalie looked at him. She still had not wiped the flour from her hands. It clung to her skin, drying there, tightening over the joints of her fingers. "Emotion ruins decisions," she repeated very softly, as if testing whether that sentence could survive in the room that had fed them for 10 years. "You're talking to me like we're arguing about the hotel delivery schedule." Ethan set his coffee down. We've been arguing about that for 2 months. We argue about everything: shifts, suppliers, Paul, the new location, payroll, every Instagram post. You know that. I know we argue, Natalie said. I just didn't know there would come a day when you'd print out a piece of paper asking me to keep the corpse of our marriage as an operating clause. Something crossed Ethan's face, not exactly pain, not exactly anger, but the irritation of a man who believed he was trying to be reasonable and was being forced to look at the ugly part of that reasonableness. He ran a hand over his face, then looked up at the old photograph on the wall. You think I don't know this is awful? Natalie looked at the picture too. In it, Ethan in his late 20s was laughing so hard his eyes nearly disappeared, one arm around her shoulders, the other hand lifting the first loaf they had sold on opening day. Natalie in the photo was thinner, her hair shorter, her eyes filled with the kind of light people have before they know a dream can turn into payroll, interest rates, commercial leases, and lies wrapped in brand storytelling. I don't know what you see anymore, she said, because for the last few years, you've looked at that photo and seen a poster. I look at it and see two people who actually slept on a kitchen floor because they couldn't afford one more employee. Ethan exhaled. I was there too, Natalie. I know, she answered at once. And that was the part that hurt the most. You used to be there. They fell silent. Beyond the kitchen door, the second deck oven clicked as it reached temperature. The clock on the wall read 5:17. Mara would arrive in 13 minutes to open the shift. In 40 minutes, the first employee would start arranging croissants on trays. In 2 hours, the front door would open. Regulars would walk in, one asking for black coffee, another asking whether the rosemary honey loaf was ready today, and an old woman named June would wave to Natalie from the table by the window and ask where Ethan was if he was not at the counter. An ordinary workday was rushing toward them, unaware that on the stainless steel table, beneath the old opening day photo, the two founders were negotiating how to preserve a marriage the way one preserves a business license. Natalie finally wiped her hands on a towel, but the flour only smeared instead of coming clean. She picked up the agreement. 12 months, at least through the loan, through the branch opening, through Paul's investment round, Ethan said. After that we can announce it, when things are more stable. Natalie gave a quiet laugh without humor. Are things ever more stable in a bakery? After the loan, it'll be after the opening. After the opening, it'll be after the holiday season. After the holiday season, it'll be after the article. After the article, it'll be after Paul wants a second round. You always have another after, because that's business. No, she said, because that's you. He looked at her longer. If we go public with a divorce right now, the bank will review the loan. Paul might pull out. The new lease has personal guarantees from both of us. The staff will panic. Mara will ask about payroll. Customers will talk. Lucas's article will turn from an expansion story into a marriage falling apart story. Do you know what they'll write? They'll say Mercer & Bloom isn't Mercer & Bloom anymore. Natalie lowered her eyes to the paper. He did not need to yell. Ethan had never needed to yell when he could place the things she loved between them and ask whether she dared let them fall. He did not say, "Stay for me." He knew that sentence had lost its power a long time ago. He said employees, bank, loan, lease, customers, community. 10 years of sweat, 14 people with paychecks due on Friday. Mara with a sick mother who needed insurance, Owen in the pastry kitchen with a newborn, Carla at the counter who had just signed a new apartment lease. He laid each of them on the table like unbaked loaves, fragile enough to collapse if she opened the oven door at the wrong time. And Natalie, who had grown up in an old apartment in Salem, where her mother had once cried over the electric bill, who had sworn she would never let anything she built with her own hands collapse, just because she could not bear a little more pain, stood there and felt the paper in her hand grow heavy as a 50-pound sack of flour. Mercer & Bloom did not begin as a brand. It began in a rented kitchen after work, a cold, narrow place with gray tile floors, a roll-up door behind them, and lighting so bad everything looked faintly blue at 2 a.m. Natalie was 29 then, an accountant for an organic food supplier, while Ethan worked in sales for a local coffee roaster. They rented the shared kitchen during the cheapest hours, from 10 at night to 4 in the morning, because they could not afford the daytime rate. Natalie tested her waffle recipe for the 17th time in an old mixer that always shook as if it were about to walk off the counter. Ethan carried flour sacks into storage, his shirt soaked with sweat even though it was cold outside, then stood beside her, dipped a finger into the batter, and got smacked lightly because he had ruined the ratio. They sold pastries at the weekend market under a white tent that Portland wind kept twisting sideways, with a hand-lettered sign, an old cash register, and the innocent belief that if a customer bit into Natalie's rosemary honey loaf, they would immediately understand why she could not stay an accountant forever. In those early days, they were poor enough that every decision had real consequences. If they bought better butter, they had to cut back on advertising. If they bought used wooden tables from a liquidation store, they had to sand them themselves until midnight. If a batch burned, they lost grocery money for the week. But back then, even exhaustion had light in it. Ethan had once wiped flour from Natalie's cheek with his thumb and said, "One day, people are going to line up outside our shop." She had laughed in his face and told him to stop talking like a motivational poster, but somewhere inside, she had believed him. They had once eaten cold pizza on the rented kitchen floor at 3 a.m, sharing a can of soda, feet aching, hands dusted with flour, and called it an anniversary dinner. They had once argued over whether to add sea salt to the top of the cookies, then kissed between the cardboard boxes because they both smelled the first successful batch come out of the oven, and knew they had done something right. Their love had not been fake from the beginning. That was what made everything that came later hurt more. If Mercer and Bloom had been born from calculation, Natalie might have calculated her way out. But it had been born from real love, from mornings when their eyes burned from lack of sleep, but they still looked at each other and laughed, from a small dream they both carried, and precisely because it had once been real, it took her far too long to accept that something real could still be turned into a prop when people no longer had the courage to tell the truth. Lucas Hale's first article ran in the fall of their 3rd year, when the shop had barely survived a summer of terrible sales. Lucas was still a young reporter for the Portland Chronicle then, and he had come to the bakery because he had heard about a young married couple making sourdough from family recipes and letting people owe them coffee when the rain was especially bad. He photographed Natalie scoring bread before it went into the oven, Ethan talking with an elderly customer at the counter, the two of them leaning against the back door of the shop, shoulders touching, laughing because Lucas told them to look at each other naturally. The article was titled, "Portland's Sweetest Husband and Wife Story." That morning, customers really did line up outside the door, not as far down the block as Ethan had once imagined, but long enough for Natalie to stand behind the counter and feel her throat tighten. People came not only for the bread, they came for the story. "I read the article," a young woman said, her eyes bright. "I want to try the loaf you two made on your first night." A middle-aged man said his wife had cried reading the part where Ethan said Natalie was the reason he believed in slow work. Natalie remembered turning toward Ethan, about to tease him for being corny. But he was already smiling at the customer, retelling the rented kitchen, the cold pizza, the night they almost quit but Natalie had said, "We don't abandon a loaf just because it hasn't risen yet." She had never said that exact sentence. She had said something close when they were standing over a failed batch of dough, but Ethan had made it prettier, rounder, easier to quote. At first, she found it funny. Then she felt proud. Then slowly she began to notice that he told their story more and more often, each time adding a little more light, removing a little more exhaustion, replacing the ugly details with sentences that sounded like lessons. He told customers they had always believed in each other, even though the week before, they had gone 3 days, barely speaking, because he had promised 200 muffins to a conference without asking her. He said at a community event that Natalie was the heart and he was the hands of Mercer and Bloom, while Natalie knew his hands touched less and less flour and more microphones. He said, "My wife and I," with warm pride in front of customers, then walked into the back office and asked why her cost sheets had to kill his energy. The brand did not replace the marriage overnight. It replaced it through beautiful stories repeated so many times that the real marriage began to sound like a flawed version of the public one. The cracks behind the pastry case did not smell like butter. They smelled like invoices, sweat, health inspection paperwork, complaint emails, and cold coffee in the cramped back office, where Natalie sat at a desk too narrow for everything it had to hold, beside an old printer, with the staff schedule pinned under layers of sticky notes. Ethan liked standing at the front counter, where the window light made the bread look more golden, where customers remembered his name, where he could explain how wild yeast required patience, just like marriage. Natalie stayed in the back, fixing shifts when Carla got the flu, calling suppliers because butter prices had gone up, calculating payroll for 14 people, asking for an extension on the new oven payment, texting Mara that they would need to cut one person from the afternoon shift if the rain kept foot traffic down. Ethan promised customers big orders because he believed in growth momentum. He signed a supply contract with a boutique hotel without asking Natalie whether the kitchen had the staff capacity. By the time she found out, the contract had already been signed and the first delivery date was 10 days away. "I'm helping us grow," he said when she stood in the office holding the contract, her hands shaking from anger and lack of sleep. "This hotel is going to put us on another level." Natalie looked at him, at the late delivery penalty clause, at the staff schedule that was already stretched thin. "No, you're selling things I have to stay up all night to deliver." Ethan frowned. "You always see the problem before you see the opportunity. Because the problem gets here before the invoice," she answered. "Opportunity is only beautiful when someone else is standing behind it paying the price." That night, Natalie stayed until 1:40 in the morning with Mara and Owen to test a doubled production schedule. Ethan stayed until 10, posted a video on social media about a turning point for Mercer and Bloom, then said he needed sleep because he had a client meeting in the morning. Mara, her hair tied high, her eyes shadowed, stood beside Natalie kneading dough and said nothing for 2 hours. Near midnight she only asked, "Do you want me to hate him with you, or are we still pretending today that he's inspirational?" Natalie laughed because if she did not, she would cry. "Today just need." Mara nodded. "Tomorrow I can hate him." Jokes like that used to help them survive. Later, when they could no longer joke, Natalie would understand that humor was also a kind of bandage, not a cure, just something to keep the blood from spreading across the floor before customers walked in. The night they first talked about divorce, the bakery had been closed for hours. Chairs were turned upside down on the tables. The glass washer still hummed behind the counter, crumbs and coffee grounds scattered across the floor, and outside the front window, a rain-soaked street glowed with the slow blur of a passing bus. Natalie sat at the table by the window, still wearing her coat because the room was cold, both hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone lukewarm. Ethan sat across from her, no longer wearing his public self, his hair mussed, his shoulders sagging. They had fought 3 times that day, first about the hotel contract, second about the PR post Ethan had approved on his own, third about the fact that he had forgotten to authorize payroll because he had been at lunch with Paul Whitaker. But by night the anger had worn itself out, leaving only a gray, exhausted heaviness. "I can't keep living like your crisis manager," Natalie said. The words were not loud. They came out of her mouth like something that had been lodged in her throat for far too long. Ethan looked down at the coffee cup in front of him. "And I can't live with someone who turns every dream into a spreadsheet." Natalie looked up. That hurt more deeply than all the times he had called her cautious. Because those spreadsheets were Mara's paycheck. They were the rent. They were the loan payment her mother had warned her not to take on. They were the oven they had bought on a credit card in year 2. They were the only thing keeping Ethan's dream from becoming a beautiful speech in front of a shuttered shop. "You think spreadsheets kill dreams," she said. "No. Spreadsheets prove whether a dream is eating the people who built it." Ethan rubbed his forehead. "We can't talk anymore." "No," she said. "We can talk, you just don't like hearing sentences that don't make you look good." He looked at her, hurt and angry at once. "You think I'm selfish." Natalie took a few seconds before answering. "I think you love the version of us that people applaud for. I don't know if you love me anymore." That sentence made the whole shop feel quieter. Ethan looked toward the street. "I don't know either." She thought that would break her. But the first thing she felt was relief, a cruel kind of relief, as if someone had finally opened the door in a room that had been running out of oxygen for too long. "Then maybe we need to talk about divorce," she said. The words sat between them, not loud, not dramatic, just cold. Ethan closed his eyes. "If we go public with a divorce now, the loan for the new branch dies." Natalie almost laughed from the pain of it. Their marriage had just been placed on the table, and his first sentence was about the loan. But then she thought about the loan too. She thought about the second location already under deposit. She thought about Paul Whitaker, the local investor preparing to put in money. She thought about the lease with both her name and Ethan's on it. She thought about the staff. She thought about all the years she had woken at 4 in the morning. The marriage was dead, but the business still breathed through both of their names. And that breath began to choke her. The agreement to stay for the business was not born in a lawyer's office, but in a series of small conversations, each one leaving another layer of fatigue over Natalie. Ethan said 1 year, just 1 year. They did not have to sleep together. They did not have to pretend in private. They did not have to do more than necessary. Just wear rings in the bakery, show up at events, answer interview questions, not tell employees about the divorce, not date publicly, not break the story until the loan was stable. Paul had invested, and the new branch could stand on its own. "Do you want Mara to lose her job?" he asked once when they were standing in the back office, the coffee grinder roaring outside. "Do you want Owen looking for work in the middle of winter? You know his wife just had a baby." Natalie looked at him and saw that he had learned to use "do you want" as a way of placing the consequences in her hands. "You could also choose not to expand this fast," she said. Ethan answered, "It's too late, we're already here. We." He always used "we" when responsibility needed to be shared, and "I" when applause was on the table. In the end, Natalie signed. She signed not because she still trusted Ethan. She signed because Mara had just asked whether there would be enough hours next month. She signed because payroll was due Friday. She signed because Paul had emailed saying he was thrilled to help build a community landmark with the Mercer couple. She signed because the bank was requesting updated ownership status before approving the loan. She signed because she could not watch 10 years of her life burn down in a week. But when the pen touched the paper, she felt not as though she were saving the shop, but as though she were signing a contract for a new role, the perfect co-founding wife, working full-time, not allowed to hurt publicly, not allowed to leave by its true name, not allowed to demand the truth if the truth lowered the value of the brand. The rules for the hollow marriage were written more clearly than their wedding vows had ever been. Do not discuss divorce with employees. Do not change the profile picture on Mercer and Bloom's shared accounts. Do not remove wedding rings during business hours. Do not refuse photos if press is present. Do not let anyone know Ethan sleeps in the living room. Do not tell Grace, his mother, until after the loan is approved. Do not tell Paul. Do not tell Lucas before the interview. At home, Ethan moved blankets and pillows to the sofa and put a few changes of clothes in the living room closet. Natalie lay alone in the bed where his breathing had once been beside her, listening downstairs to the sound of him turning on the faucet, a glass touching the sink, the television murmuring quietly before going off. For the first time in years, she had the whole bed to herself, but it did not feel spacious. It felt like lying on a stage after the audience had left, lights still on, props still in place, the actor unsure where to take off the costume. At the bakery, Ethan still called her Nat in a warm voice. "Nat makes the best rosemary loaf in Oregon," he told a regular customer, his hand resting lightly on her back when someone asked for a photo. Natalie's body went cold each time. Her skin remembered that hand before her mind could recoil from it. Some gestures were once intimacy, then habit, then props, and the final stage was the cruelest, when other people looked at them and still mistook them for love. One busy Saturday morning, before Lucas came but while a food blogger was visiting, Ethan pulled Natalie close for a picture in front of the counter. "Smile," he said quietly. She smiled. Not broadly, just enough. When the blogger left, she walked into the storage room, shut the door, put both hands on the flour rack, and breathed slowly so she would not vomit. Mara came in afterward with an inventory list, then stopped when she saw Natalie's face. "You don't have to answer me if you don't want to," Mara said. "But if a man who used to love you has to remind you to wear your ring the way we remind staff to wear hairnets, then something is very wrong." Mara Chen saw the truth through tiny details before Natalie dared to tell it. Mara had worked with Natalie since Mercer and Bloom had 3 employees and a cash register that jammed constantly. She was short, with chin-length black hair, sharp eyes, a quick mouth, and loyalty that was never blind. Mara knew Natalie drank black coffee when she was tense, added sugar to tea when she was hurt, and only said, "I'm tired" when she was close to breaking. She saw that Ethan and Natalie no longer looked at each other when they spoke, only at the schedule, the contracts, the POS screen. She saw Natalie staying in the office later not to work more, but to avoid going home at the same time as Ethan. She saw Ethan start making marketing decisions by email and only CC Natalie afterward, as though informing her instead of discussing it. One morning, after kneading dough, Natalie took off her ring beside the sink because flour was stuck in the setting. She forgot to put it back on. A regular customer walked in and asked whether the couple would be joining the Christmas market that year. Ethan was at the counter, glanced down at Natalie's hand, and said very quietly without smiling, "Ring, just one word." Natalie put the ring on immediately, so fast she felt ashamed of herself. Mara was reaching for cups behind them and heard it. She said nothing in front of the customer. But afterward, in the storage room, she asked, "Are you okay?" Natalie was about to say, "Just tired," and the sentence had almost reached her lips when she saw Mara raise an eyebrow. "You've been saying that for 6 months, Mara said. "Tired is when you haven't slept enough. This isn't not enough sleep." Natalie sat down on a flour bin. She did not tell her everything, not yet. She only said, "There are things that if they came out right now would put the bakery at risk." Mara set down her clipboard. The bakery is already at risk if the person keeping it alive is dying in the storage room. That made Natalie turn her face away. Mara did not hug her. Mara knew Natalie did not like to be hugged when she was about to cry. She simply stood there, among the flour and cardboard, until Natalie stood up on her own. Some witnesses do not need the whole truth to understand that a lie has taken up too much space. Paul Whitaker came to the bakery on a drizzly afternoon wearing an expensive wool coat, a gray scarf and leather shoes too clean for someone who walked much in Portland. Paul was not exactly a bad man. He was a man who saw opportunity with very bright eyes, who knew how to say community and sustainability in the same sentence as profit margin, who genuinely complimented Natalie's bread but still assessed it as part of a model. He wanted to invest in a second branch in a busier neighborhood near offices, where Mercer and Bloom could sell more, look better, be bigger. Natalie prepared the numbers, ingredient costs, profit margins by product line, staffing risks, and plans to maintain quality. Ethan prepared the story. They sat at the corner table where customers liked to photograph their laddies because the light was good. Paul flipped through the numbers and nodded, but when he spoke, he looked more at Ethan. "The numbers are solid," he said, "but the strongest thing you two have isn't the bread." Natalie looked up. Paul smiled. "It's the story. A husband and wife building from nothing. People buy that trust. They don't just buy a loaf. They buy the feeling that in a world full of anonymous chains, there are still two real people making something with love and discipline." Ethan smiled, leaned forward, and placed his hand over Natalie's on the table. His hand was warm. She left hers still. The investment was sitting between them. Paul looked at the gesture and was clearly pleased. "Exactly," he said. That is the brand." Natalie heard the word brand and felt Ethan's hand on hers turn into a label. Her marriage had been priced, not in divorce papers, not in law, but in the ability to make customers believe they were still what they had once read about in the paper. Paul did not need them to love each other. He needed them to look like they loved each other long enough for that belief to become revenue. After the meeting, Ethan said Paul understood. Natalie stood at the counter cutting into a test loaf, the serrated knife passing through the crisp crust. "He understands the brand," she said, "not us." Ethan took off his coat and hung it over a chair. "Right now, the brand is what keeps us alive." She looked at him. "Do you hear yourself?" he answered. "I hear reality." And Natalie understood that Ethan's reality was a room where anything could be sold if the story was beautiful enough. Grace Mercer, Ethan's mother, came to the bakery carrying flowers the week after the news of the expansion began to spread among regular customers. She wore a moss-green raincoat, her silver hair neatly brushed, a bouquet of wildflowers from the market in her hand, her face full of pride. Grace had always loved Natalie in a way that was both warm and heavy. She had often said Natalie was the best thing that had ever happened to Ethan, not because she thought her son was bad, but because she knew Ethan had a tendency to fly too far on his own ideas. "You keep him grounded," Grace had said many times, as if it were the most beautiful compliment she could give her daughter-in-law. That day, she hugged Natalie in front of the counter, the faint scent of perfume and rain clinging to her coat. "I heard Paul thinks the expansion is going wonderfully. I'm so proud." Ethan stood beside her, smiling. "It's not done yet, Mom, but things are moving in the right direction." Grace turned to Natalie and took both of her hands. "You've always been the one who keeps Ethan from flying too far. I don't know what he would be without you." Natalie used to like that sentence. It used to make her feel valuable in the Mercer family, not just as a wife, but as someone seen. Now it pressed down on her like a job title with no vacation days. The one who kept Ethan from flying too far. The brake, the accountant, the person who fixed his promises, the person who made his visions into something that did not bankrupt itself. If she stopped holding him, he would fall, and everyone would look at her as the one who had let go. Grace knew nothing about the agreement. She did not know Ethan was sleeping on the sofa. She did not know Natalie had signed a paper agreeing to maintain their public marriage. She only saw a married couple standing in a busy bakery, and felt that her son's life was steady. Natalie squeezed her hands. "Ethan has to stand on his own too," she said gently. Grace laughed, thinking she was joking. "Men like him need a smart woman to pull them back." Ethan laughed with his mother. Natalie looked at them and saw something very old and very deep. No one in that room believed they were hurting her. That was what made it harder to breathe. Some systems do not need clear villains. They only need everyone to call one woman's endurance a gift. Ethan began using Natalie's silence as leverage sooner than she wanted to believe. One Tuesday afternoon, she discovered that he had signed a memorandum of understanding to supply pastries to a local 3-store chain for a 6-week trial. No signature from her, No capacity assessment, no staffing plan. Just an email Ethan sent to Paul. This will show we're ready to scale. Natalie read the email in the office, the printer rattling behind her, while Mara dealt with a customer complaint about sold-out croissants at the front. She called Ethan in. He walked in with a busy look, phone in hand. What did you sign? She turned the laptop toward him. Ethan looked at it, not nearly startled enough. It's a small pilot, 3 stores, 6 weeks, daily morning delivery, with our current kitchen. The new branch will open soon. This creates traction for Paul. We agreed every major decision needed both signatures. Ethan closed the office door and lowered his voice. You're overreacting. Natalie laughed dryly. Don't use that sentence in a room with payroll pinned behind me. He stepped closer, his voice still low and controlled. You're not going to blow this up. You care about the bakery too much. The sentence silenced her. Not because he was right in the way he intended, but because he had just spoken the true mechanism of the entire agreement. He no longer needed to persuade her with love. He did not need to apologize. He did not need to acknowledge that he had broken their rule. He only needed to know that Natalie would not slam her hand on the desk in front of the staff, would not email Paul to say they were privately separated, would not let Mercer and Bloom lose an opportunity because of his reckless decision. She cared too much about the bakery. Ethan had turned the greatest love she had left into a rope around her wrists. Natalie looked at him, and for the first time, saw that his danger did not lie in misunderstanding her. He understood her perfectly. He understood that she would save things, and he had begun building every risk on that assumption. The hidden PR invoice surfaced in the secondary email one night, while Natalie stayed late in the office checking cash flow. She was looking for a butter delivery confirmation when she found a folder labeled Brand Development, and inside it, an invoice from a boutique PR firm Ethan had hired to prepare the new branch campaign. It included a short video about the Mercer love story, lifestyle photography, opening night media consulting, and a retainer large enough that if next month's revenue dipped, payroll would be squeezed. Part of the invoice had already been paid using an advance from the future contract Ethan had signed with the store chain. Natalie sat in the glow of the screen, hearing Owen pull trays from the oven somewhere outside, the sound of metal distant and hollow. She opened each file. There was a video storyboard. Ethan and Natalie kneading dough together, laughing in the kitchen, hands brushing, Ethan saying, "We built this with love and stubbornness," Natalie looking at him admiringly. Natalie let out a very small laugh, almost silent. They were not just planning to sell the old story. They were planning to reenact it like an advertisement, with her cast as an actress in her own life. When Ethan returned to the office, she placed the invoice in front of him. "What is this?" He looked at it, then said, "Investment. This is an advance from a contract that hasn't even started yet. If we want to grow, we have to invest. If we want to live, we have to breathe first." He pulled out the chair and sat down. "You don't understand marketing. I understand money leaving the account before money comes in. You always talk to me like I'm a child who needs an adult to control him. Because you spend like someone who believes someone else will clean up." Ethan struck the table lightly with his hand, not hard, but hard enough to make the papers tremble. "I'm trying to save our future." Natalie looked at him. "You're trying to film a video about our love while you sleep on the sofa." He stood. "That's exactly why we need the video, so people don't look at the sofa." The sentence fell out of him before he could correct it. They both heard it. Ethan turned away at once. Natalie said nothing. Because what could be said when someone had confessed not through apology, but through strategy? The interview with Lucas Hale took place on a rare sunny morning. Portland light spilled through the front windows, soft and pale gold, making the bread case look almost peaceful. Lucas was 10 years older than when he had written the first article, a few strands of gray in his hair now, but he still had the habit of listening more carefully than most reporters. He had come to write about the second branch. Ethan was delighted. He wore a denim shirt with the sleeves rolled, stood in front of the counter, and talked about sustainable growth, community, and how Mercer and Bloom would keep its family soul while expanding. Natalie sat beside him at the corner table, her hands in her lap, a streak of flour still caught under one nail. Lucas turned on his recorder and asked, "After 10 years, what's the secret to being both spouses and business partners?" Ethan smiled without needing to think. "Trust," he said. "We always choose the business and each other. Not every day is easy, but Natalie and I understand that Mercer and Bloom pulls us back to what matters." Natalie heard the word trust like a shard of glass under her tongue. Lucas turned to her. "Natalie?" She had prepared the familiar PR answer. She could talk about communication, respecting each other's roles, everyone having different strengths. She had said those things many times, but that morning, something inside her stalled. She looked down at the table and saw a speck of dried flour clinging to her thumbnail. She remembered the first morning in the rented kitchen, remembered Ethan wiping flour from her cheek, remembered him just saying trust, remembered the agreement beneath the old photograph, remembered the PR storyboard saying she looked at him admiringly. She looked up. There are days when sitting across from each other is harder than opening the shop, she said. Ethan turned toward her at once. His smile did not fall completely, but it hardened. Lucas was silent for a second, his gaze sharpening. What do you mean? Natalie felt Ethan shift his foot beneath the table, a signal. She did not look at him. I mean, people love beautiful stories about married couples working together, but working together doesn't automatically keep people close. Sometimes it only makes leaving more expensive. The air at the table changed. Ethan gave a light laugh, trying to turn it into controlled honesty. Nat is always more practical than I am. She keeps us honest. Lucas looked between them and wrote something down. After the interview, Ethan pulled her into the office. What are you doing? Answering. You deliberately made Lucas suspicious. Maybe I'm just not as good at lying smoothly as you are. Ethan looked at her, his eyes darkening. Are you going to destroy everything just because you need to feel right? Natalie answered. No. I'm starting to think everything was already destroyed because you need to feel believed. After the agreement, even the last small kindnesses became contaminated. One night, Ethan fell asleep in the office chair, still holding the menu design notebook, his neck bent at a painful angle, hair fallen across his forehead. Natalie stood in the doorway looking at him, and for one very brief second an old memory returned. Ethan younger, asleep on a folding chair in the rented kitchen, mouth slightly open from exhaustion, hands still dusted with flour. She wanted to take a coat and cover him. Then she saw the draft of his opening night speech lying on the desk beside him. My wife Natalie has always been the steady heart of our shared dream. The sentence stopped her hand in midair. He could turn even his exhaustion into a beautiful scene. He could be sleeping because he had worked hard, yes, but tomorrow he could also stand in front of Paul and use the word wife as part of a pitch. Natalie took her own coat instead and did not cover him. That coldness did not make her feel lighter. It made her feel as though she were becoming someone else. Not someone more cruel, but someone who no longer knew which gestures were innocent. Another morning, Ethan brought her coffee in the office, exactly the kind she liked, black with a twist of orange peel that the new barista had learned from her. He set it down beside her laptop. You did a good job with the cost sheet yesterday. She looked at the coffee, then at him. What do you need me to sign? His face changed. I just brought you coffee. She wanted to believe that. She wanted to believe that for at least a few seconds he still remembered she was the woman who had once stayed awake beside him, not just a co-owner. But the agreement had broken that ability. When a relationship is preserved by clauses, every gentle act begins to look like an appendix. Ethan quietly left the office. Natalie stayed there, staring at the coffee until it went cold. She did not drink it, not because she wanted to punish him, because she no longer knew whether drinking it meant accepting tenderness or accepting strategy. That was what the agreement did to whatever human part was left between them. It did not merely preserve the shell of the marriage. It killed the last ability to believe in small things. Sofia Ramirez did not say much while Natalie sat in her office overlooking the Willamette River. Sofia was a business attorney, her black hair pinned neatly back, a navy blazer on, her desk so clean that Natalie felt embarrassed by the crumpled receipts in her bag. There was no Rachel in this story, but Mara had quietly given her Sophia's number through a regular customer. You need someone who can look at papers as papers, not as wedding vows, Mara had said. Sophia read the private separation agreement, the loan contract, Paul's email, the PR invoice, the lease terms for the new branch, then set everything down. Do you know what the most dangerous thing here is? Natalie almost laughed. Pick one. Sophia did not laugh. You're trying to save a business by allowing the person damaging it to keep standing beside you as a trustworthy co-owner. Natalie fell silent. The sentence was neat and brutal. Sophia continued, Mercer and Bloom can be restructured. It won't be easy, and it won't be clean. You could buy out shares, separate operational roles, sell the second branch, renegotiate the loan, bring in an independent audit, or, in a worst-case scenario, shrink the business. But it cannot be saved through a legal blind spot called marriage. Right now you are wife, co-founder, operator, and risk shield. He can blur every one of those roles to pressure you. Natalie looked out at the river, where gray water moved slowly under a low sky. If I tell the truth, the bakery could lose the investment. It could. Employees could lose hours. They could. People will say I destroyed it. Sophia leaned back in her chair. Some people will say that. People who benefit from a lie often call the truth sabotage. Natalie closed her eyes. I don't want to lose everything. You're already losing it piece by piece. The sentence did not feel like encouragement. It felt like a diagnosis. Natalie left Sophia's office with a stack of papers, an action list, and the strange feeling that the way out was not a bright door. It was a dark hallway with broken glass underfoot. But at least it was a hallway. Rumors spread through the bakery after an argument in the storage room that Owen overheard half of, Carla heard another half of, and by noon the air behind the counter had changed. The staff did not ask directly, but they watched Natalie longer when she passed, went quiet when Ethan entered, whispered near the glass washer. Mara finally pulled Natalie into the office. I need to ask something unpleasant. Natalie closed her laptop. Ask. Is next month's payroll safe? The question hurt Natalie more than many questions about the marriage. Because this was what Ethan always placed on the table, but from Mara's mouth it was not a weapon. It was real life, rent money, medicine for Mara's mother, Owen's child's daycare. Natalie wanted to say yes immediately, wanted to reassure her, wanted to be her old self, the person who kept everyone from being afraid. But she thought of the PR invoice, the store chain contract, the loan that might not be approved. This month is safe, she said slowly. Next month, we'll need to adjust the schedule and menu to make sure. I'm working with a lawyer and an accountant. I won't let everyone's wages become collateral for decisions Ethan and I made personally. Mara looked at her. Personal decisions meaning what? Natalie exhaled. I can't tell you everything yet, but I will tell you when it matters, not when it's good for the image, when it means nobody gets blindsided by paperwork. Mara was quiet for a moment, then said, Don't let us be the reason you keep getting crushed. Natalie looked at her. But you were the reason I signed. I know, Mara answered. That's why I'm telling you not to do it anymore. Some forms of forgiveness do not make a person feel lighter. They only remove the excuse to keep punishing oneself. Natalie sat alone after Mara left, looking at the shift schedule. She had always thought leadership meant taking pain into herself so others would not have to see it. But maybe real leadership was sometimes saying there was a crack before the floor collapsed beneath everyone. When Natalie began demanding an internal audit, Ethan struck back with a new story. He did not tell Paul the marriage was dead. He said Natalie was too fearful, too conservative, too attached to the old shop to understand the growth stage. Paul's emails began going directly to Ethan more often, with Natalie copied as a courtesy. One evening, she found an email chain about the opening campaign with 31 messages before she had been added. In it, Ethan had written, Natalie is brilliant operationally, but she's cautious to a fault. I'll help bring her around. Bring her around. Like something Daniel had said about Emily in another story. But this was Natalie's life. Pull her back, make her understand, bring her to agreement. She stared at the screen until her eyes hurt. After all those years of keeping Mercer and Bloom alive through slow sales months, surprise health inspections, a pandemic, a broken oven, and Ethan's overpromising, he had found a way to turn her caution into an obstacle. The narrative shifted quietly. Natalie had once been the steady heart of the bakery. Now she was the one who did not believe in the future. Her spreadsheets had once been proof she was good. Now they were evidence she lacked vision. She sent an email stating that all financial and marketing decisions required approval from both co-founders under the company agreement. Ethan walked into the office 10 minutes later, his face tight. Are you trying to embarrass me in front of Paul? You erased me in front of Paul first. This isn't the time to measure egos. No, this is the time to measure money. He laughed under his breath. Listen to yourself. Money, money, money. Do you even remember why we started this? Natalie stood. I remember exactly. And because I remember, I don't want you selling my grandmother's recipe in a franchise deck like it's a slogan. Ethan froze for a beat. You saw the deck. Yes, I saw it. The rosemary honey loaf recipe was the most private thing Natalie had ever put into Mercer and Bloom. It began in her grandmother's notebook, a brown cloth-bound book with frayed edges, several pages still dusted with old flour, the handwriting slanted and a little shaky. Her grandmother had never owned a bakery. She only baked in her small kitchen on Sundays, using rosemary from the garden, local honey, sea salt, cheap flour, and a lot of patience. Natalie had adjusted the recipe after 17 failed attempts, adding fermentation time, changing the hydration, finding a honey that left a warmer finish. That loaf was why customers came back. It was the thing Lucas had mentioned in the first article. It was what June bought every Friday for her daughter. It was what Natalie made when she needed to remember who she was beyond invoices. and Ethan had placed it in the investment materials as core intellectual property suitable for scalable production and future licensing. Natalie sat in front of the PDF, one hand on the old notebook open on the desk, comparing her grandmother's handwriting to the clean font in the deck. "You don't get to do that," she said when Ethan stood in the office. "The recipe belongs to the company," he answered, though his voice was less sure than usual. "It's sold under Mercer & Bloom. It's a brand asset. It was mine before there was a company, and you brought it into the company. I brought bread into the shop. I did not give my grandmother to Paul Whitaker to package into a franchise." Ethan rubbed his face. "You're being emotional." "Of course I'm being emotional. It's my family recipe. If we want to grow, everything has to belong to the system." Natalie looked at him for a long time. "Is that what you truly believe? That if something wants to grow, every private thing has to be swallowed by the system?" He did not answer. She closed the notebook carefully, like closing a small coffin. "This is when I understand," she said. "You don't just want me standing beside you. You want every sellable part of me to remain inside the company even after I'm no longer your wife." Ethan was angry. "You're making it sound like I stole from you." Natalie placed her hand on the notebook. "You call it a brand asset, so you don't have to call it by its real name." The night before the new branch opening, Natalie stood alone inside the nearly finished space. The wooden counter shone brighter than the old one. The walls were painted a warm cream. The pendant lights had not been adjusted yet, so one corner still sat in shadow, and the room smelled of fresh paint and new wood instead of the sourdough scent that had soaked into the walls of the first shop. Ethan walked around, excited, talking about customer flow, camera placement, the photo backdrop for bloggers, where Paul would stand for his remarks. "After the opening we can breathe," he said, running his hand over the counter. Natalie stood by the window and watched their reflections in the glass. They looked like co-founders inspecting a new location. No one looking in would know they had been sleeping separately for months. "And after that?" she asked. Ethan turned. "What?" "After the opening," he shrugged. "After that we talk, really talk, about everything." She nodded very slightly. "After the opening, then after Lucas's article, then after Paul decides whether to stay in or increase his investment, then after the holidays, then after the store chain trial, then after the bank updates the terms." "Do you ever run out of afters?" Ethan looked tired. "Do you want to blow everything up right before the most important night? I want to know whether there is ever a time the truth is allowed to exist without being called sabotage." He looked at her, and in his eyes there was something between pity and irritation. "Natalie, maybe you're not built for this stage." The sentence was quieter than a slap. She looked at the new wooden counter, the new lights, the new wall, and understood that Ethan had reached a place in his mind where she was no longer the person building with him. She was the old part that had to be carried along long enough for the story to transition. That night she went back to the old shop instead of going home. She opened the back door and turned on the kitchen lights. The old opening day photograph still hung on the wall. Beneath it, the stainless steel table was empty. She sat in front of the cold oven, opened her grandmother's recipe notebook, and placed her hand over the rosemary honey loaf page. She did not cry. Crying requires a soft place. That kitchen was not soft, it was where she made decisions. She picked up her phone and called Sophia. "Tomorrow," she said. "I'm not going to stand there as proof of his marriage anymore." The opening night of the second branch was so crowded that the inside of the windows fogged over. Customers, food bloggers, investors, a few reporters, regulars from the old shop, employees in new uniforms. Paul Whitaker beside the Mercer & Bloom backdrop, Grace Mercer wiping away tears of pride, Mara near the counter managing operations but always watching Natalie. The sign behind them read, "Mercer & Bloom, built by hand, shared with love." Ethan wore a white shirt and a new apron and looked radiant in the way the press liked. Natalie wore a simple black dress under her apron, her hair tied low, her wedding ring on her hand because she had decided to wear it one last time in the place where it had been used the most. Paul spoke first, about community, small business, and big dreams. Lucas stood nearby, recorder in his pocket, observing. Then Ethan stepped up. He held the microphone, looked out at the crowd, and smiled the smile that had carried them through 10 years of articles, events, customers, and promises. 10 years ago, he began, Natalie and I stood in a rented kitchen with no money, no sleep, just one bread recipe, and the belief that if you make something with love, people can feel it. The room laughed warmly. Natalie stood beside him, hearing every sentence like a song she had once loved being played at a funeral. Ethan continued, "We didn't just build a bakery. We built a promise to each other and to this community. Natalie and I have always chosen this together. He turned to her and held out his hand the way he always did, the way he had done in hundreds of photographs. As if that gesture were the natural punctuation mark at the end of the Mercer story. Natalie stepped up beside him, but she did not take his hand. She took the spare microphone from Mara, who handed it to her with a very steady hand. The crowd did not understand yet. Ethan understood first. His face changed slightly. "Nat," he said quietly, away from the microphone. She looked at him, then at everyone else. "I love this place enough not to keep lying about it," Natalie said. Her voice was not loud, but the sound system carried it through the new room. A murmur rose and then disappeared. Ethan stood stiffly beside her. Paul frowned. Grace raised a hand to her chest. Natalie continued. "Mercer & Bloom was built from real things. 4 o'clock mornings, failed batches, loans we weren't sure we could repay, employees who did far more than their job descriptions, customers who came back in the rain just to buy a familiar loaf. And once, it was also built from real love between Ethan and me." That made Grace cry immediately. Natalie did not look at her too long, because if she did, she might soften. "But our marriage ended long before tonight. We have been privately separated, and we kept our marriage public because we were afraid that if the truth came out, the business would collapse. I agreed because I was afraid of losing 10 years of my life, afraid employees would lose jobs, afraid customers would lose trust, afraid everything we built would be called fake. But the pretending itself has begun to lead this place by image instead of truth." Ethan reached for her microphone. "Natalie, not here," she turned to him. "Here is exactly where you wanted me to stand as proof." He lowered his voice, but the microphone still caught part of it. "You're destroying everything." Natalie looked at him, and this time her anger was not hot, it was cold. "No, I'm refusing to let everything be saved by a dead marriage." The room went silent, not completely silent, but silent in the way a crowd becomes when no one knows whether they have just witnessed an accident or a confession. Natalie took the packet of papers from Mara. "I have been working with a lawyer and accountant on a restructuring plan. This month's payroll is protected. We will conduct an independent audit of expansion costs in the PR campaign. Franchising and recipe licensing will pause. Financial operations will be separated from marketing and brand development. Investors will receive full and accurate records before deciding whether to continue or withdraw. I am not asking anyone to call this a beautiful story. I am only asking that it not continue to be sold through a lie." Paul stepped forward, his face red. "Natalie, this is highly inappropriate." She turned to him. "More inappropriate than valuing my marriage as a brand asset." He went silent. Ethan said, "You could have done this privately." Natalie answered, "We've done everything privately for too long." Lucas raised his recorder but did not ask a question. Mara stood behind her, eyes red but chin lifted. Grace was crying, not loudly, only trembling. A few customers left, a few stayed. Owen stood in the new kitchen, a towel still in his hand, looking at Natalie as if for the first time he was seeing his leader not only protect payroll, but protect the right to call the truth by its name. There was no victory that night, no loud applause, no clean justice. Only a brand torn open, a man losing control of the story, and a woman finally allowing the room to see what she had forced herself to hide for far too long. The consequences were not clean. Paul withdrew part of the investment within 48 hours and demanded a review of terms. Lucas's article was no longer a sweet PR piece about the new branch, but a long, uncomfortable story about the cost of turning marriage into a brand in local business. The headline was not cruel, but it was enough to make the city talk. Some customers called Natalie brave. Some said she should have handled it privately. Some never came back because they felt deceived. Others came more often, bought bread in silence, and left large tips. The bank requested an updated risk profile. The new branch had been open only 3 weeks when they had to cut hours because cash flow could not support it. Ethan was angry, truly angry, no longer wrapped in enough charm. He said she had stolen the stage, ruined their work, humiliated him in front of Paul, his mother, the community. Natalie heard all of it through attorney emails and meetings where Sophia sat beside her. She did not answer the parts that did not need answering. There were days when she thought she had destroyed everything. There were mornings when she stood behind the counter of the old shop, saw fewer customers, and felt guilt bite into her bones. Mara reminded her to eat. Owen asked whether they should simplify the menu to cut costs. Carla cried because she was afraid of losing her job, then hugged Natalie and apologized for crying. Natalie did not become a hero. She became a woman negotiating debt, selling off equipment from the new branch, cutting items from the menu, reducing open days, explaining every line of a survival plan to her staff. The truth did not create a miracle. It only stopped the lie from eating further into the bone. and on many days that looked almost insufficient. A year later, the second branch had been sold to another group for a price that was not beautiful. Mercer and Bloom returned to being a smaller, less glamorous shop, with no line on the website calling it a husband and wife bakery. No photo of Ethan and Natalie on the About page, no PR video about love and endurance. Ethan left operations, still holding a small portion of shares that were being bought back gradually under the agreement. The marriage officially ended in a short, cold court hearing where the judge read legal sentences. The attorneys nodded. Ethan did not look at Natalie for long, and Natalie signed her name with a hand that did not tremble but did not feel light either. There was no scene where they embraced and cried. No thank you for the beautiful years. Some marriages end with screaming, some end with an email. Natalie and Ethan's ended with the sound of a pen on paper, and the sense that every word that needed to be said had been used too often in marketing. So when real life finally needed them, none of the words were whole. On the first morning after the sale of the second branch was complete, Natalie returned to the old shop at 4:03. Portland was still raining. She opened the back door and turned on the kitchen lights. The blue-white fluorescent glow fell over the stainless steel table, the oven, the flour racks, the scratches on the floor. The kitchen was smaller after a year of chaos, but truer than any polished new space had been. She opened her grandmother's recipe notebook and ran her fingers over the rosemary honey loaf page. She had not made it in months. At one point, she had thought she might never make it again, because Ethan had touched it with the language of assets. Paul had looked at it through the eyes of franchising, and she herself had seen it turned into a slide in a deck. But that morning she weighed flour, poured water, added starter, rosemary, honey, salt. She kneaded slowly. Dough clung to her hands. The scent of rosemary rose green and warm. No one filmed her. No one asked for the story behind it. No one stood beside her saying, "My wife." When the batch came out of the oven, the crust crackled softly, a tiny sound in the quiet kitchen. Natalie placed a slice of bread on the table by the window, the same table where she and Ethan had once sat across from each other in those final years, talking like partners, arguing like opponents, sitting silent like strangers. She did not eat right away. She watched the steam rise and understood that not everything that survives remains whole. Some things survive by losing their old shape. After that, she brought out the small ladder, climbed up, and took the old opening day photograph down from the wall. The edges had faded slightly from kitchen heat. Ethan in the photo was still smiling like a man who believed he would never use a love story to sell a lie. Natalie in the photo was still smiling like a woman who did not yet know she would one day have to take that very moment down in order to breathe. She did not tear it. She did not smash the frame. She did not throw it away. She wiped the dust from the glass, wrapped it in brown paper, and placed it in a storage box with old newspaper clippings, their first lease, and the handwritten menu board from opening day. The past does not disappear just because it is no longer hung on the wall, but it also no longer had permission to stand there as proof that the present had to keep kneeling before it. On the empty space, Natalie hung a small new sign, light wood with simple black lettering, Mercer and Bloom, baked honestly. She stepped back and looked at it. It did not stir some grand emotion. It did not make her feel healed. It was simply right. Outside the window, the city was beginning to wake. Mara would arrive in 20 minutes. Customers would come after that. Some would ask where Ethan was. Some would already know. Some would not care as long as the bread was good. Natalie stood in the kitchen at 5:12 in the morning, just like the morning a year before, and completely unlike it. The work was still hard. The debt was still there. The marriage had nothing left to preserve. Mercer and Bloom was smaller, quieter, less praised by the press. But every loaf that came out of the oven no longer needed a lie standing behind it. Ethan lost the thing he loved most, the stage where he could tell a beautiful story about himself. Natalie lost the man who had once kneaded dough beside her in a rented kitchen, lost the version of the dream where love and work could hold each other up forever, lost even the innocence of believing that something built by hand could never become a prison. She survived, but she did not return to the woman she had been. She understood that some dreams can only keep living when people are brave enough to bury the dead part of them by its true name. And that morning, when she unlocked the front door, when the small bell above it rang, when the scent of rosemary honey loaf drifted into the rainy street, Natalie did not smile for the brand, did not smile for the press, did not smile for a man standing beside her. If she smiled at all, very faintly, it no longer belonged to the story other people needed to believe. It belonged to the part of her that had been scorched, but had not agreed to become ash.